My name is Thomas, and when I was a boy, no older than 12 years, Blackwood Cemetery was less a place of sorrow and more a sprawling ancient puzzle box tucked away behind the whispering pines at the edge of our quiet village. Most folks in Oakhaven avoided it, especially after twilight fell and the mist curled around the moss-laden stones like spectral fingers. They'd say it was disrespectful to disturb the dead, or that old Mrs. Gable down by the creek had once seen a flicker of lamplight in the unhallowed hours, but I knew better. They were scared. Not of ghosts, not truly, but of the weight of its silence, of the stories it refused to tell. My father, a stoic man who mended boots and rarely spoke of anything beyond leather and laces, would merely grunt when I mentioned it, a sound that conveyed both disapproval and a grudging understanding of a boy's boundless curiosity. He didn't forbid me from going, not outright, which I always took as tacit permission. Blackwood wasn't like the small, tidy churchyard in the village square, where the stones were new and the flowers were fresh. No, Blackwood was ancient, forgotten, a tapestry of crumbling slate and granite woven with ivy and wild roses. Some of the markers were so old, worn smooth by a century of wind and rain, that the names etched upon them were mere ghosts of letters. These were the pioneers, the earliest settlers, their tales buried with them. But it wasn't these time-worn veterans that drew me, not really. It was something else. Something far more peculiar and deeply unsettling, something that ignited a spark of persistent wonder within my young heart. Tucked away in the furthest, most overgrown corner of the cemetery, where the ancient oak, split by lightning years ago, cast a perpetual shadow, lay the enigma, 28 graves. They were unlike any others in Blackwood. Uniformly spaced, laid out in 4 neat rows of 7, each grave was marked not by an ornate headstone or even a simple wooden cross, but by a plain, uncarved stone, roughly the size of a loaf of bread, planted upright in the earth. No names, no dates, not a single inscription, just silent, gray sentinels standing guard over untold secrets. They were identical, each a twin to the next, as if crafted by the same hand for the same purpose, a stark contrast to the sprawling individuality of the rest of the cemetery. It was as if a piece of a forgotten battlefield had been transplanted directly into our tranquil burial ground, except there was no record of a battle anywhere near Oakhaven. The local gossips, usually so keen to spin a yarn about anything from the miller's new wife to the sudden blight on Old Man Hemlock's potato crop, grew strangely quiet when the subject of the 28 graves arose. Old Man Silas, who ran the general store and knew every family history back 3 generations, would just scratch his chin, eyes distant, and say, "Some things are best left undisturbed, boy." Even Miss Alara, the village schoolmistress, a woman who prided herself on knowing every historical fact about Oakhaven, would simply sigh and change the subject to the autumn harvest or the merits of arithmetic. This collective silence, this deliberate evasion, only fueled my fascination. Why were these graves so different? Why did no one speak of the souls who rested beneath those unmarked stones? It was as if the village had collectively agreed to erase them from its memory, to pretend they simply did not exist. But they did. They were undeniably there, a stark, uniform testament to some forgotten tragedy. My early visits to Blackwood were cautious forays, brief expeditions quickly concluded by the setting sun or the rumble of distant thunder. I'd skirt the main path, dodging tangled roots and tripping over hidden mounds, always making my way towards that shadowed corner. The air around the 28 graves felt different, heavier, thick with an unspoken history. Other parts of the cemetery evoked a quiet sadness, a reverence for lives lived and ended. But this section hummed with a profound stillness, a sense of something unfinished. I would sit for hours on a fallen log, just observing, trying to glean a clue from the smooth, silent stones. I imagined the people buried beneath, Them, their faces, their lives, the circumstances that brought them to such an anonymous end. Were they family? A group of travelers? Victims of some forgotten pestilence? My young mind raced, conjuring possibilities, each more compelling than the last. I drew maps of the cemetery in my worn notebook, marking the location of the 28, sketching their stark simplicity, trying to find a pattern, a meaning, anything that would break their resolute silence. I'd count them again and again. 28, always 28, never more, never less. It was a number that began to echo in my thoughts, a numeric mystery. One crisp autumn afternoon, emboldened by the golden sunlight that dappled through the thinning canopy, I decided to venture closer than ever before. I noticed, for the first time, a faint, almost imperceptible discoloration on one of the stones, a reddish-brown stain that seemed to seep from the very heart of the rock. It was barely visible, easily dismissed as a natural mineral deposit, but to my intensified gaze, it stood out starkly against the gray. I reached out a tentative finger, tracing the cold, rough surface. It felt old, ancient, and it sent a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the cool breeze. I pulled my hand back quickly, feeling a sudden, inexplicable sense of trespass, as if I had touched something sacred and forbidden. The graves, usually just a source of intellectual curiosity, suddenly felt alive with their unyielding secret. I walked away that day with a new sensation clinging to me, not just wonder, but a growing unease, a feeling that perhaps some silence was meant to remain unbroken. But the intrigue was too deep-seated now. The faint stain, the uniform simplicity, the village's refusal to speak. It all conspired to draw me back, day after day, week after week, to the silent graves of Blackwood Cemetery, determined to uncover the truth they guarded so fiercely. My boyish innocence was slowly giving way to a nascent obsession, a burning need to understand what had transpired in that forgotten corner of the world. It felt like a riddle whispered just beyond, the edge of hearing constantly tantalizing me, pulling me deeper into the past. That reddish-brown stain on the stone, barely a smudge to an uninterested eye, began to consume my thoughts. It wasn't rust, I knew that much. Rust flaked and faded, but this seemed embedded, a part of the stone itself, almost like a scar. It wasn't the vibrant red of fresh blood, but rather a muted ancient hue, reminiscent of dried earth after a storm, or perhaps, disturbingly, dried iron. I started carrying a small piece of chalk in my pocket, not for drawing, but for marking. Each time I visited the graves, I'd make a tiny, almost invisible chalk mark on the stained stone, right beside the discolored patch. I wanted to see if it grew, if it changed, if time or weather affected it. It never did. It remained stubbornly, unsettlingly the same, a permanent blot on the otherwise unblemished surface of the rock. My visits to Blackwood became more frequent, my approach bolder. The initial unease I felt from touching the stained stone soon transformed into a relentless drive. I started to scrutinize every detail, not just of the 28, but of the entire cemetery. I'd spend hours wandering through the older sections, reading the faded inscriptions, trying to learn about the people of Oak Haven's past. I'd search for any other unmarked graves, any other anomalies, hoping to find a pattern or a context for the silent 28. But there were none. Every other grave, no matter how old or humble, bore a name, a date, a faint epitaph. The uniformity of the unmarked stones in that specific corner only deepened their mystery. I decided the answer wasn't going to be found simply by observation. It was time for a more direct approach. If the villagers wouldn't speak, perhaps their records would. My first target was the village church. Old Pastor Elijah, a man whose sermons were as dry as sun-baked parchment, kept meticulous records of births, deaths, and marriages. I knew he stored them in a musty room off the vestry, a room I'd only ever glimpsed when helping my mother. Dust the pews. It was a long shot, but if anyone had been buried in Blackwood with the church's blessing, There had to be a record. One sweltering summer afternoon, I volunteered to help Pastor Elijah tidy the church grounds. He was a kindly man, if a bit absent-minded, and he readily accepted my offer. While he was engrossed in pruning the overgrown rose bushes by the entrance, I slipped into the church, my heart thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird. The vestry door creaked open, revealing a small, dark room smelling faintly of dust and old paper. Stacked high on shelves were ledgers bound in leather, their pages yellowed with age. My hands trembled as I pulled down the largest, heaviest one, the death registry. I sat on a wobbly stool, the sunlight filtering weakly through a small, grimy window, illuminating dancing motes of dust in the air. Page after page, I meticulously scanned entries, looking for anything unusual. A mass burial, a group of deaths clustered together, or perhaps even a mention of an unknown epidemic. The entries were mostly mundane. John Miller, aged 72, consumption. Sarah Green, aged 45, childbirth. Infant Doe, stillborn. Names, dates, causes of death. But no mention of 28 individuals buried at once, no section for unidentified or unmarked. I scoured the years, going back as far as the ledger allowed until my eyes blurred and my head ached. Nothing. The book was a detailed tapestry of Oakhaven's departed, but the thread of the silent graves was conspicuously absent. It was as if they had simply appeared without entry or explanation outside the recorded history of the village. A knot of frustration tightened in my stomach. If the church records, the official keeper of life and death in Oakhaven, held no answers, where else could I look? The only other place I could think of was the old town hall, where the town clerk, Mr. Henderson, kept the village archives. Mr. Henderson was a notoriously grumpy man, with spectacles perched precariously on his nose and a perpetual scowl. He was less likely to be swayed by a boy's helpful intentions than Pastor Elijah. Accessing those archives would require stealth and perhaps a bit of luck. My chance came during the annual Oakhaven Harvest Festival. The entire village, including Mr. Henderson, would gather in the town square for games, food, and merriment. The town hall would be deserted. Under the cover of twilight, with the distant strains of fiddle music and laughter drifting on the autumn air, I crept towards the sturdy oak door of the town hall. It was locked, of course. My father, with his knack for mending things, had once taught me how to pick a simple lock using a thin piece of wire. I'd practiced on the shed door at home, never imagining I'd use it for something like this. My heart pounded a frantic rhythm against my ribs. After several tense minutes of fumbling in the near darkness, I heard a satisfying click. The door creaked open, revealing a cavernous, echoing space filled with the scent of old wood and even older papers. The archive room was at the back, behind a row of empty offices. It was a treasure trove of forgotten history, old maps, land deeds, census records, even dusty copies of the very first Oakhaven Gazette. I fumbled for the oil lamp I'd brought, its flickering light casting long, dancing shadows on the shelves. This was it. If the answers existed anywhere in Oakhaven, they would be here. I began my search focusing on any records of epidemics, unusual events, or large-scale deaths. I found records of a smallpox outbreak in 1842 that claimed a dozen lives and a terrible winter storm in 1870 that led to several deaths from exposure. But nowhere, absolutely nowhere, was there any mention of a group of 28. It was as if their existence was actively erased, not merely forgotten. As I sifted through a particularly heavy ledger detailing the land allocations for the original Oakhaven settlers, a small unbound drawing fluttered to the floor. It was a crude, faded sketch, clearly not official, perhaps a child's drawing or a casual doodle. It depicted a cluster of small, upright stones, very similar to the ones in Blackwood Cemetery, though they were rendered without names. Around them, in shaky, childlike script, were the words, "The Quiet Ones." My breath hitched in my throat. Could this be it? A clue, however small? The drawing was tucked into a land deed dated 1888. I examined the ledger's binding, wondering if it had simply slipped in by chance or if it had been deliberately placed there. There was a faint, almost invisible imprint on the back of the drawing, as if it had once been pressed against something. I quickly slipped the drawing into my pocket, my heart racing with a mixture of fear and triumph. It wasn't a direct explanation, but it was something. It was an acknowledgement, a whisper from the past that someone else, at some point, had noticed these peculiar graves and perhaps even given them a name. The Quiet Ones. The name resonated with the profound silence that clung to that corner of the cemetery. It made the mystery feel even more personal, more immediate. I carefully placed the ledger back, extinguished the lamp, and slipped out of the town hall, leaving no trace of my illicit entry. The night air felt cooler, sharper, no longer just a backdrop to my secret adventure, but a conspirator in my pursuit of the truth. The journey to understanding the 28 silent graves of Blackwood Cemetery had just begun. The crude drawing of The Quiet Ones was more than just a piece of faded paper. It was a jolt, a physical tremor that ran through me. It was proof that I wasn't alone in noticing those graves, that someone else, nearly a century ago, had also felt their strange pull, perhaps even named them. The year 1888 gnawed at me. My father wasn't born then, nor my grandparents. It was a time I could only imagine from the sepia-toned photographs in our family album, a world of stiff collars and horse-drawn buggies. Yet, this drawing connected me directly to it, a thin, tangible thread across decades. I examined it repeatedly under the feeble light of my bedside lamp that night, turning it over and over, searching for anything more. The faint imprint on the back, as if something had been pressed against it for a very long time, suggested it wasn't just casually misplaced. It felt almost like it had been hidden, or perhaps protected. My next step became clear. I needed to find someone who remembered. 1888, someone whose memory stretched back far enough to recall anything about the time the Quiet Ones were drawn. Oakhaven was a small village, its roots deep, and there were a few individuals whose lives seemed to span generations. The most likely candidate, the living embodiment of Oakhaven's forgotten past, was Old Man Fitzwilliam. He lived alone in a ramshackle cottage on the outskirts of the village, surrounded by ancient apple trees and an even more ancient hound. Folks said he was well over 90, his eyes roomy but sharp, his mind a vast, dusty archive of local lore and gossip. My mother always warned me to keep my distance. He was known for his biting wit and impatience with childish questions, but desperate times called for desperate measures. The following Saturday, armed with a small basket of fresh-baked bread, a peace offering from my mother's kitchen, I approached Fitzwilliam's cottage. The hound, a massive gray-muzzled creature, named Brutus, lifted his head lazily as I pushed open the rickety gate, gave a single deep woof, and then seemed to decide I wasn't worth the effort of getting up. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. I knocked tentatively on the warped wooden door. After a long moment, it creaked open a sliver, revealing a pair of piercing blue eyes set in a network of wrinkles. "What in tarnation do you want, boy?" Fitzwilliam's voice was gravelly, like stones tumbling down a hill. I held up the basket. "My mother sent this, sir, and I had a question." His eyes narrowed, but the scent of warm bread seemed to temper his usual gruffness. He swung the door open wider. "Well, come in then. Don't stand there gawking. And don't track mud on my rug, if you please." The inside of his cottage was a chaotic wonderland of forgotten things, stacks of books reaching to the ceiling, curious old tools, a taxidermied owl perched precariously on a shelf, and the comforting aroma of pipe tobacco. He motioned to a worn armchair by the crackling fireplace, and I sat down, clutching the drawing of The Quiet Ones in my pocket like a precious, fragile secret. "So, what's this burning question you have, boy? Come to ask if witches fly on broomsticks or if the moon is made of cheese?" he rasped, taking a piece of bread from the basket and examining it critically. "It's about Blackwood Cemetery, sir," I began, my voice a little shaky. "Specifically, a corner with 28 unmarked graves. They're just plain stones. No names." A flicker, quick as a hummingbird's wing, passed through his eyes. His chewing slowed. "Blackwood, eh? Not a place for the living, that." He looked away, gazing into the flames. "Some things are best left buried, Thomas. Some questions are better left unasked." It was the same sentiment I'd heard from everyone else, but coming from Fitzwilliam, it carried a heavier weight, a sense of knowing. "But I found this," I said, pulling out the drawing, unfolding it carefully. "It's from 1888. It calls them the Quiet Ones." He stopped chewing altogether. His gaze snapped to the drawing, and a profound change came over his ancient face. The sharpness remained, but it was overlaid with something else, something I couldn't quite decipher, a mix of recognition, sadness, and perhaps a flicker of fear. He took the drawing from my hand, his gnarled fingers surprisingly gentle, and held it close to his eyes. "The Quiet Ones," he murmured, the words barely a whisper. "Haven't heard that name in a long, long time." He traced the crude lines of the stones with a trembling finger. "Aye, this is accurate. A child drew it, I reckon. Perhaps young Alara. She was a child back then, always scribbling." My mind reeled. Miss Alara, the schoolmistress, the one who always avoided the topic? The revelation sent a fresh jolt through me, a new direction for my investigation. Fitzwilliam sighed, a deep, weary sound that seemed to carry the weight of decades. They were a group, strangers. Came to Oakhaven in the dead of winter 1888. A hard winter it was, too, snow up to the eaves. They were passing through, they said, heading west for the new lands. He paused, his gaze fixed on the fire, as if watching a scene unfold in its dancing flames. There were whispers, before they arrived, of a sickness, a fever they called it, sweeping through the frontier towns. Oakhaven thought itself safe, tucked away, isolated. He took another piece of bread, breaking it absently. They camped on the edge of town, by the old mill pond. 28 of them, men, women, children, all of them. And then the sickness found them. It struck fast, Thomas. Too fast. No time for doctors. No time for cures. Just a rapid, terrible decline. His voice dropped to a near whisper. The villagers were terrified. They said it wasn't just a fever, but a plague, a punishment. They sealed off the camp. No one went in. No one came out. Not for days. When the snow finally lifted and the bravest men went to check, they were all gone. All 28. Dead in their tents, huddled against the cold and the fever. A chill snaked down my spine, colder than any winter wind. The vividness of his words painted a grim picture, far more terrifying than any ghost story. "And they were buried? There?" I managed to ask, my throat tight. He nodded slowly. "Aye. The ground was frozen hard, couldn't dig proper graves, so they just laid them to rest where they lay, right where they fell. The plain stones were all they could manage. No names. No one knew their names, truly. And no one wanted to risk the sickness by lingering too long, digging deeply. It was a hurried, desperate burial. He looked at me then, his blue eyes surprisingly clear. Fear, Thomas. Fear is a powerful thing. It makes men do difficult things, forget things. His words hung heavy in the air, explaining the silence, the unmarked graves, the missing records. It wasn't a deliberate erasure out of malice, but a desperate collective act of self-preservation, a burying of a terrifying memory. But then, Fitzwilliam's gaze drifted back to the drawing, and a new, unsettling thought seemed to cross his face. "But that stain you mentioned," he said, looking at me intently. "That reddish-brown mark on one of the stones. That wasn't from the fever, boy. That was from something else. Something before." Fitzwilliam's words about the stain on the stone hung in the air, heavier than the wood smoke. "That wasn't from the fever, boy. That was from something else. Something before." The statement cracked open the neat, tragic explanation of a fever, revealing a deeper, more unsettling layer to the mystery. My mind, already buzzing with the revelation of Miss Alara's drawing and the grim story of the travelers, now latched onto this new, perplexing detail. Before the fever? What could have caused a stain, one that seemed so permanent, on a burial marker, especially if the burials were hurried and desperate? It implied a violence, a specific event that predated the quiet, desperate deaths from illness. I pressed him, my voice barely a whisper. "Before? What do you mean, before?" Fitzwilliam leaned back in his chair, his eyes now distant, focused on something only he could see in the dancing flames. "There were rumors, whispers, even before the snow really set in. When those folks arrived, they weren't whole. Not all of them. One of them. He was already injured. Badly. A wound, they said, from a scuffle on the road further west. No one knew the full tale, mind you. They were close-lipped, these strangers. But the wound, it festered, and he was the first to fall. My breath caught. A wound. Not just sickness. "And the stain?" I prompted, pushing. He turned his gaze back to me, and for a moment, I saw a flash of something in his eyes that made me shiver. Not fear, exactly, but a deep, old sorrow. "That stone was for him, boy. The one they laid first. The one who brought the ill omen with him. It was a dark time, Thomas. Desperate. People in Oakhaven were scared, truly scared, that the illness would spread to us. So when he died, they buried him quick. And some folks say that stain appeared on the stone the very next morning. A mark, a warning." He paused. A long, thoughtful silence. "Or perhaps," he continued, his voice dropping to a gravelly murmur, "it was just the frozen ground, the rough handling. But in a time of fear, a mark like that takes on a meaning. It speaks to the terror people felt. This new piece of the puzzle, a single death preceding the fever, a specific wound, and that persistent stain, created a far more complex picture than I had imagined. It wasn't just a group of unfortunate travelers succumbing to a disease. There was an initial unsettling event that somehow tainted the very first grave. It was a tangible link to a different kind of suffering, a violent prologue to the silent tragedy. I left Fitzwilliam's cottage that day with my head swimming. The bread forgotten, my mind was consumed by the image of a wounded man buried hastily, his solitary grave bearing a permanent, ominous stain. The next time I visited Blackwood, I went straight to that particular stone, the one I had marked with chalk countless times. I knelt beside it, feeling its cold, unyielding surface. The reddish-brown stain seemed to pulse with a new, chilling significance. It wasn't just a random discoloration. It was a silent testament to a forgotten moment of suffering, perhaps, even violence, that ushered in the nightmare of 1888. My attention, now sharpened by Fitzwilliam's story, began to pick out new details in the silent rows. The overall uniformity was still striking, but now I could almost discern subtle differences in the way the stones were set, the slight variations in their shape. Were these mere inconsistencies of haste, or did they subtly hint at the order in which the 28 had fallen? I started to map them, not just their location, but imagining their progression. Which was the second, the third? Each grave, though anonymous, now carried a phantom identity, a place in the terrible procession of death. The idea that Miss Ilara, my mild-mannered schoolmistress, had drawn that cryptic picture also weighed heavily on me. She was a woman of logic and reason, always encouraging us to seek knowledge and understand the world. Yet she had actively avoided the topic of the graves, her silence now seeming less like ignorance and more like a deliberate act of suppression. I knew I had to speak to her. It was a daunting prospect. Miss Ilara was a formidable presence in the classroom, her stern gaze capable of quelling any mischief with a single glance. Approaching her about such a delicate and, to her, clearly painful subject felt like walking into a lion's den. I waited until after school, when the last of my classmates had scampered out into the late afternoon sun. Miss Ilara was tidying her desk, gathering her papers. My heart hammered against my ribs, but the burning need for answers propelled me forward. "Miss Ilara?" I began, my voice a little reedy. She looked up, her spectacles glinting in the fading light. "Yes, Thomas." "Did you forget something?" "No, miss. I wanted to ask you something. About Blackwood Cemetery." A subtle stiffening, barely perceptible, passed through her posture. Her hand, which had been reaching for a stack of textbooks, paused. "Blackwood Cemetery, Thomas? What about it?" Her voice was calm, but there was an underlying tension I now recognized. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "The 28 unmarked graves, miss. The ones in the far corner. Old man Fitzwilliam told me. He said you might have drawn this." I pulled out the faded sketch, unfolding it and placing it gently on her desk. Her eyes widened slightly as she looked at the drawing, a sudden flash of something akin to shock passing over her face. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the crude lines just as Fitzwilliam's had. A long, profound silence stretched between us, filled only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than I had ever heard it, tinged with a deep, almost ancient sorrow. "Thomas," she said, her gaze lifting to meet mine, her eyes unexpectedly moist. "Where did you find this?" I told her briefly, about my visit to the town hall archives. She listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. When I finished, she sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of decades. "Yes," she finally confirmed, her voice barely a whisper. "I drew this. I was a very young girl then, no older than 7 or 8, and I called them the quiet ones because no one would speak of them. No one would name them." She looked down at the drawing again, her fingers smoothing the creased paper. "It was a terrifying time, Thomas. I remember the fear, the silence, the way the adults would whisper, then stop when a child came near. It was like a shroud had fallen over our village." Her memory, direct and personal, painted an even more intimate portrait of the fear that had gripped Oakhaven. It wasn't just a historical fact. It was a lived experience, burned into the memories of those who had witnessed it. "Fitzwilliam told me about the fever," I ventured, "and about the first one, the one with the wound." Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with surprise. "He told you that? Old man Fitzwilliam. He remembers a great deal." She closed her eyes for a moment, as if battling a wave of old, painful memories. "Yes, there was a man. He arrived with them, bleeding. He was a difficult man, angry. He brought trouble with him. even before the sickness took hold. He was buried first, and that mark was seen as an ill omen by many, a sign of the darkness they carried. Her voice was trembling slightly now. My father, he was one of the men who went to the camp after the snow melted. He never spoke of what he saw. Not truly. But I remember the look on his face when he came home. He was a strong man, Thomas, but he looked broken. And he told my mother that the fear was as deadly as the fever, for it made people turn their backs on those in need, even when they knew it was wrong. This was it. The direct, painful truth from someone who had lived through it, even as a child. The fear that had prompted the hurried, unmarked burials, the collective amnesia of the village, it all made a terrible, tragic sense. But still, the stain. What about the stain, Miss Alara? I asked, my voice low. Fitzwilliam said it wasn't from the fever. He said it was from something else. Something before. Her eyes, still holding the distant sadness, met mine. That stain, Thomas, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, was from the blood, not just of the sick man, but of something else entirely, something they carried with them, something they were trying to escape, something that pursued them even to their graves. Something that pursued them even to their graves. Miss Alara's words echoed in my head, chilling me far more than any winter wind. The idea that these people, already weakened by illness and the harsh journey, were running from something else, something tangible enough to draw blood and leave a stain on a tombstone, was a terrifying thought. It transformed the silent graves from a somber historical tragedy into a chilling narrative of desperate flight and relentless pursuit. My previous theories of a simple fever outbreak or a forgotten accident shattered, replaced by a much darker, more active threat. The fear that had gripped Oakhaven in 1888 suddenly seemed more justified, less a product of ignorant superstition and more a primal terror of the unknown. I thanked Miss Alara, my voice hoarse, and left the schoolhouse in a daze. The setting sun cast long, skeletal shadows across the village green, and the usual sounds of children playing and distant chatter seemed muted, replaced by the thumping of my own heart. The air felt colder, charged with a new, unsettling energy. I didn't go straight home. Instead, I found myself drawn back to Blackwood Cemetery, almost as if an invisible thread pulled me. The twilight seemed to deepen the shadows around the silent graves, making them loom larger, their anonymous stones no longer just symbols of forgotten lives, but grim markers of an escape that had failed. I knelt again by the stained stone, its surface rough beneath my fingertips. The reddish-brown mark seemed to glow with a malevolent light in the fading day. If this was the blood of someone injured by their pursuer, what kind of pursuer could leave such a lasting, indelible mark? It wasn't just a simple chase. It implied something more primal, more terrifying than bandits or vengeful enemies. My boyish curiosity had turned into a desperate need to know, to understand the true nature of the evil that had stalked these 28 souls. The cemetery, once a place of quiet discovery, now felt infused with a new, subtle tension. I began to notice things I hadn't before. Not just the subtle differences in the stones, but also the ground around them. The grass was thinner here, the weeds more stunted. It was almost as if the very earth struggled to sustain life in that cursed patch. I ran my hands over the cold soil, feeling for anything unnatural, any subtle depression or rise that might suggest a struggle, a hurried burial. But the ground was flat, undisturbed, a century of earth settling over its secrets. Gaze drifted to the ancient oak tree that overshadowed the graves. Its lightning-scarred trunk was immense, its branches gnarled and twisted like arthritic fingers. It had stood there for centuries, a silent witness to everything. Could it have seen something? Could it hold a clue in its ancient bark? It was. A foolish thought, born of a desperate imagination, but I traced the deep crevices in its trunk, hoping for some hidden message, some sign. Then my eyes caught something, not on the tree itself, but beneath its roots, almost completely swallowed by the earth and a tangle of ivy. It was a fragment of something, dark and metallic, barely visible. My heart leaped. With trembling hands, I dug at the earth, pulling away the matted roots and damp soil. Slowly, painstakingly, I unearthed it. It was a small, ornate locket made of tarnished silver, its surface intricately carved with symbols I didn't recognize. They looked like twisted vines, or perhaps serpents, woven into a complex, unsettling pattern. The silver was dark with age, but beneath the grime I could see glints of its former luster. It was heavy in my palm, and as I turned it over, I felt a small, almost imperceptible click. The locket wasn't just decorative, it was functional. My fingers fumbled with the clasp, which was stiff with rust and dirt. After a few agonizing moments, it popped open with a faint groan, revealing not the expected faded photographs, but two tiny, dried, pressed flowers, their petals long since turned to dust, and beneath them a folded piece of parchment no bigger than my thumbnail. It was so fragile, so delicate, I almost feared it would disintegrate in my hands. Carefully, I unfolded it. The parchment was brittle, its edges crumbling, but the ink, though faded, was still legible. The script was elegant, flowing, unlike anything I'd seen in Oakhaven. It read, "Beware the whisperers. They follow the scent of fear. They claim the lost. No rest for the damned, even in death." My breath hitched in my throat. The whisperers. The name sent a wave of cold dread through me. It wasn't a human threat, not quite. It sounded ethereal, yet chillingly real, a name that perfectly captured the unseen, pursuing horror Miss Alara had hinted at. And the line, "No rest for the damned, even in death," suggested a horrifying continuation of their pursuit, even beyond the grave. It explained the villagers' deep-seated fear, their desperate silence. This wasn't just a physical sickness. It was a spiritual contagion, a malevolent force that tainted everything it touched. I looked up from the locket, my gaze sweeping over the 28 silent graves. The revelation hit me with the force of a physical blow. They weren't just running from the whisperers. They were trying to escape their claim, to find peace where there was none. And Oakhaven, in its fear, had inadvertently become a part of the whisperers' chilling domain, allowing their victims no names, no proper farewells, just silent, unmarked stones. The faint stain on the first stone, the blood from the man who arrived wounded, now seemed like a beacon, a chilling signpost for whatever malevolence followed them. I carefully refolded the parchment, placed it back in the locket with the dust of the flowers, and snapped it shut. I would keep it safe. This locket, this tiny forgotten artifact, was the key. It was a tangible link to the horror that had visited Oakhaven a century ago. It spoke of a threat far grander and more terrifying than any epidemic. It spoke of the Whisperers. And suddenly, Blackwood Cemetery, which had always been a place of quiet historical mystery, transformed into a battleground of forgotten terror, a place where a desperate struggle had once unfolded, leaving behind its silent, chilling testament. I realized then that my journey into the past had taken a dark, unexpected turn. The graves weren't just silent, they were screaming, and I was finally beginning to hear their desperate cries. The boy who once saw the cemetery as a puzzle now saw it as a warning, and the weight of that knowledge settled heavily on my young shoulders.